January 2020, the lives of the Mercer family were shattered in a single, tragic moment when a dark secret finally came to light, leading to a fatal collision that no one could have foreseen. The Mercer family lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood in Boston, where everything seemed perfect from the outside. Timothy Mercer, known as Tim, was a 35-year-old successful financial consultant. He had built a stable career, earning a reputation for his sharp mind and dedication. Tim was married to Laura Mercer, a 33-year-old devoted housewife. Laura dedicated her life to caring for their two young children, Emily, 8, and Jake, 5. She took great pride in maintaining a warm and loving home. The Mercers were the picture of suburban success, but beneath the surface, something dark was brewing. In late 2019, Laura's younger brother, Dominic Marshall, known as Dom, moved in with the Mercer family. Dom, 29, was an artist who had recently gone through a painful breakup. Openly gay, vibrant, and unapologetically himself, Dom was the complete opposite of Tim. Despite their differences, Tim had always admired Dom's confidence and self-assurance. Dom's presence in the Mercer household would stir feelings in Tim that he had buried for years. The connection between Tim and Dom started innocently enough. They bonded over shared interests like art and sports, often spending hours talking in the living room, while Laura busied herself with household chores or putting the kids to bed. These moments, which at first seemed harmless, slowly began to evolve into something more. Lingering glances turned into subtle touches, and before long, the tension between them was palpable. Tim found himself drawn to Dom in ways he had never experienced before. He felt both excited and terrified by these new feelings. Dom sensed Tim's internal conflict and began to subtly flirt, testing the boundaries of their relationship. Tim, despite his growing attraction, struggled with guilt. He was a married man with a family, and these feelings were something he never anticipated. Laura, completely absorbed in her role as a mother and homemaker, was oblivious to the storm brewing within her home. But soon the friendship between Tim and Dom became more than just a connection. It became a source of torment for Tim. He was caught in a web of conflicting emotions, attraction, guilt, and fear. The emotional turmoil led to sleepless nights and a growing distance between him and Laura. Laura noticed the change but chalked it up to the stress of Tim's work and the demands of raising two young children. Little did she know that the man she had been married to for nearly a decade was grappling with feelings that could destroy their family. Dom, on the other hand, was fully aware of the power he held over Tim. He enjoyed the thrill of pushing boundaries and watching Tim squirm under the weight of his desires. Dom found himself increasingly drawn to Tim, not just because of his physical appearance, but because of the challenge Tim represented, a married man with a seemingly perfect life, now caught in a moral quandary. This was new territory for Dom, and he was both excited and terrified by what it could mean for his relationship with his sister. And for a while it seemed like they had found the perfect balance, an unspoken agreement to keep things as they were, without crossing the line. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension between Tim and Dom continued to build. What had started as innocent camaraderie was quickly evolving into something much darker and more complex. Tim was struggling to keep his emotions in check, and Dom was enjoying the game they were playing. But soon it became clear that the feelings between Tim and Dom were more than either of them was prepared to handle. Tim was starting to notice how every interaction with Dom left him feeling more conflicted, his mind spinning with thoughts he never imagined he would entertain. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore. Tim was developing deeper emotional feelings for Dom, feelings that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. The more time he spent with Dom, the more he felt his carefully constructed life slipping away from him. As the weeks passed, Tim and Dom found themselves spending more and more time together, often late into the night. They shared whiskey-fueled conversations about art, life, and the struggles Dom faced as a gay man. Dom opened up to Tim in ways he hadn't with anyone else, sharing the pain of his recent breakup and the challenges of being openly gay in a world that still didn't fully accept him. Tim, in turn, found himself feeling a mix of empathy and an inexplicable attraction that he struggled to suppress. One night after Laura had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Dom decided to test the waters further. Dom teased Tim about his sexuality, throwing out playful comments that had a darker edge. Tim, who had already had a few drinks, didn't push back. The tension between them was electric, and Dom could sense that he was close to breaking down Tim's defenses. And then it happened. Dom leaned in and kissed Tim. Tim, shocked at first, didn't pull away. The kiss became more passionate, igniting a fire that both terrified and exhilarated Tim. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't deny the intensity of what he was feeling. Dom knew he had crossed a line, but the thrill of it all was too much to resist. This encounter marked the beginning of a secret affair between the two men. They stole moments whenever they could, always careful to hide their relationship from Laura and the children. Tim was consumed by guilt, but the thrill of the affair was too intoxicating to resist. The secrecy only heightened the sexual tension between them, making each stolen encounter more intense than the last. Dom, fully aware of the power he now held over Tim, began to push boundaries even further. He introduced Tim to new sexual experiences that excited and disturbed him in equal measure. Tim found himself drawn deeper into the affair, unable to pull away despite the overwhelming guilt and fear that came with it. Laura began to notice changes in Tim. He became more distant, often lost in thought, and their once regular sex life dwindled to almost nothing. She attributed it to stress. After all, being a financial consultant was a demanding job, and taking care of their young children was no easy task. Laura started to sense that something was off, but she had no idea that the true cause of Tim's distance lay within the walls of their own home. Dom continued to live under their roof, playing the role of the charming and helpful brother-in-law, while secretly reveling in his conquest. And for a while it seemed like the affair might go unnoticed. But as the weeks turned into months, the burden of their secret began to weigh heavily on both men. Tim started to experience physical symptoms of the stress. His heart would race at the thought of Laura discovering the truth. His hands would shake during mundane tasks, and he would find himself unable to concentrate on anything for long. His work began to suffer, and his colleagues noticed the changes. They started to wonder what was wrong with Tim, but no one could have guessed the true reason behind his unraveling. But soon it became clear that the affair between Tim and Dom was spiraling out of control. Tim was struggling to keep up the facade of a loving husband and father, while Dom was grappling with the guilt of betraying his sister. They both knew that something had to give, but neither of them was prepared for what would happen when their secret finally came to light. The affair between Tim and Dom continued, but what had once been a thrilling secret began to feel like a heavy burden. Dom, who deeply loved his sister Laura, started to feel guilty for betraying her trust. Dom began to distance himself from Tim, hoping that by pulling away he could protect Laura from the devastating truth. But the more Dom tried to pull away, the more Tim found himself drawn to him. Tim was caught in a web of conflicting loyalties, his duty as a husband and father on one side, and his intense emotions for Dom on the other. The fear of losing everything he had built with Laura gnawed at him daily. Tim became more withdrawn, his mind constantly preoccupied with thoughts of what might happen if Laura ever found out. The stress began to take a toll on his health, leading to frequent migraines and sleepless nights. But soon Tim began to realize that his feelings for Dom were more than just physical. He started to see Dom as more than just a lover. Dom became his confidant, his escape from the pressures of his life, and the one person who understood him on a level that Laura never could. This realization terrified Tim even more, as he knew that these feelings could never be fully realized without destroying his family. Both men were haunted by the possibility of their secret being exposed, and this fear began to consume their every thought. They became increasingly paranoid, interpreting even the most innocent of Laura's comments or questions as signs that she might be growing suspicious. And Tim started to dread the moments when he was alone with Laura, worried that she would somehow see through him, that she would notice the guilt written all over his face. He avoided eye contact with her, made excuses to stay late at work, and found himself struggling to maintain the image of a devoted husband. Dom, on the other hand, was retreating deeper into his art, using it as a means to channel his guilt and anxiety. His once vibrant, colorful paintings began to take on darker tones, reflecting the turmoil he felt inside. Dom knew that he couldn't keep living like this, lying to his sister every day, but he was trapped by his own emotions. He loved Tim, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. Yet the thought of hurting his sister was just as devastating. But soon it became clear that this balancing act couldn't last forever. Laura was growing more and more concerned about the changes she saw in both Tim and Dom. She felt a growing distance between her and her husband, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her. She tried to bring them closer together, suggesting family outings, date nights, anything that might help bring back the closeness they once had, but nothing seemed to work. Laura even started to worry that Tim might be having an affair, but she couldn't imagine who it could be with. She considered confronting him directly, but fear held her back. Fear of what she might discover, fear that her worst suspicions could be true. The idea of losing the man she loved, of shattering the family they had built together, was too much to bear. But soon Laura's suspicions would become impossible to ignore. Tim began to exhibit signs of extreme stress. He was losing weight, his hair was thinning, and he was constantly on edge. He would jump at the smallest noises, and he seemed to be living in a constant state of fear. Laura noticed that he was always checking his phone, hiding the screen whenever she walked into the room, and he became overly protective of his privacy. These behaviors only deepened her suspicions, and she began to quietly observe Tim, looking for any clues that might explain his erratic behavior. Laura realized that it wasn't just Tim who was acting strangely. Dom had become increasingly reclusive, spending most of his time in his studio, and when he did interact with the family, there was a palpable tension between him and Tim. Laura started to notice the way they avoided each other's gaze, the way their conversations were strained and awkward, as if they were hiding something from her. But soon Laura's unease would come to a head. The situation escalated when Laura announced that she wanted to have another child. This news hit Tim like a ton of bricks, as it forced him to confront the reality of his marriage. The idea of expanding their family while harboring such a dark secret filled him with dread. Dom, too, was shaken by the news, realizing that if Laura became pregnant, the stakes would become even higher. Tim felt trapped, as though the walls were closing in on him. He knew that something had to change, but he wasn't sure how to escape the situation without destroying everything he held dear. One night after Laura had gone to bed, Tim and Dom had a tense conversation in the kitchen. Dom, overwhelmed by guilt, insisted that they needed to end their affair before things spiraled further out of control. Tim, though reluctant to let go, knew that Dom was right. They couldn't continue living in fear, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that Laura might discover their secret. But ending the affair didn't bring the relief they had hoped for. Instead, it created a new layer of tension as both men struggled to navigate their complex emotions. Tim tried to throw himself into his work, hoping to rebuild his relationship with Laura and forget about his feelings for Dom. But his efforts were half-hearted, driven more by guilt than by genuine desire. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a lie, and the weight of that lie was crushing him. Dom, on the other hand, became increasingly isolated. His guilt and fear of hurting his sister drove him into a deep depression. He spent long hours in his studio, trying to lose himself in his art, but the creative process offered little solace. Dom was consumed by thoughts of what he had done and the knowledge that he had betrayed the one person he cared about most in the world. But soon Dom's mental state began to deteriorate further. He started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where Laura discovered the truth, and the family was torn apart in a violent, chaotic confrontation. These dreams haunted him day and night, making it impossible for him to find peace, even in his art. Dom began to fear that he was losing his grip on reality, that the line between his nightmares and the real world was becoming blurred. Laura, noticing the changes in both men, grew more concerned. She tried to bring the family closer by planning a weekend getaway, hoping that time away from their daily routines would help them reconnect. Tim and Dom, though apprehensive, agreed to the trip, each secretly hoping that it might help them find some clarity. But soon it became clear that the getaway would only heighten the tension. The weekend began uneventfully, with the family settling into a cozy cabin in the woods. Laura hoped that the change of scenery would do them all some good, but Tim and Dom were on edge from the start. Small incidents, An awkward silence, a misplaced comment, heightened everyone's anxiety. Laura began to sense that something was seriously wrong, but she didn't know what. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with unspoken words, and both Tim and Dom were terrified that the truth might slip out. On the last night of the trip, after the children had gone to bed, Laura finally confronted Tim and Dom. She couldn't take it any longer. The tension, the secrecy, the feeling that something was being kept from her. Laura's voice trembled with fear and frustration as she demanded to know what was going on. Tim and Dom exchanged panicked glances, realizing that they couldn't keep up the facade any longer. But soon the truth that had been buried for so long would come crashing down, with devastating consequences. In the face of Laura's desperate pleas, Dom couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. He broke down, confessing his love for Tim and the affair that they had been hiding. Laura was devastated, her worst fears confirmed. She turned on Tim, accusing him of betraying her in the worst possible way. Tim, overwhelmed by guilt and shame, tried to apologize, but Laura was too hurt to listen. In a moment of desperation, Laura ran out of the cabin, unable to process what she had just heard. Tim and Dom chased after her, terrified that she might do something drastic. They found her standing on the side of a dark, winding road, crying uncontrollably. Tim tried to comfort her, but Laura was inconsolable. She lashed out at both men, her pain and anger pouring out in a torrent of accusations and heartbreak. In the heat of the moment, Tim stepped into the road, trying to plead with Laura to come back to the cabin. Dom, standing a few steps behind, watched helplessly, his heart breaking for both his sister and the man he loved. But soon the night would take a turn that none of them could have predicted. As Laura continued to sob, a car came speeding down the road. The driver, a young man in his 20s, was distracted and didn't see Tim in time. There was a sickening thud as the car struck Tim, sending him crashing to the ground. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out, horrified by what he had done. Dom rushed to Tim's side, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. Tim was unconscious, blood pooling beneath his head. Laura collapsed to the ground, her sobs turning into hysterical screams as she realized what had happened. But soon the reality of the situation would sink in, and the full weight of their actions would come crashing down on them. In the chaos that followed, the paramedics arrived and rushed Tim to the hospital, but it was too late. The impact of the collision had caused severe trauma, and Tim succumbed to his injuries before they could stabilize him. The aftermath was a blur of grief and shock. Laura was left to grapple with the loss of her husband and the shattering of her marriage. Dom was consumed by guilt, blaming himself for everything that had happened. The secret they had fought so hard to keep buried had ultimately led to the destruction of their family.